In this video, we'll get an introduction to CSS. So the lessons in this video come from my course Pure HTML and CSS from Scratch, and this follows the HTML introduction built with lessons from the course released a few days ago. So if you haven't seen that lesson yet, I'll link it in the description as well as the courses to set you up for building HTML email templates. So without further ado, here are the lessons from the course that I've selected to give an introduction to CSS. So for the first lesson, let's get into how HTML is selected for CSS styling with the CSS syntax. So we'll select the heading 1 tag with h1, then we'll add our opening and closing curly brackets, which represents a style declaration, followed by the property of our style, which is color, and then after that we have a colon, followed by the value, which is blue in this case, and then the semicolon. So we have the h1 color is blue. So now what I'll do is I'm going to copy this and add the style tag in the head section of the document. Then I'll paste in h1 color blue, and the spacing that you use around the styling here is really up to you. You can have no space at all, or you can add the styling property and value or color and blue on a separate line, which I prefer to do, as well as prefer to have it in line with the style tag. So now additionally, I'm going to add a new style property and value. So I'll add text align, then colon, and then center, like we did in the previous lesson. So now let's spell this out inside of paragraph text so we can see it visually, which each section of the CSS syntax means. So let's start with the heading 1, which is the selector. So I'll add a paragraph tag here, and then I'm going to number these. So I'll add number 1, and then in quotes, h1 is the selector. So we're selecting the heading 1 element or heading 1 tag to apply our CSS to it. Next, we have the opening and closing curly brackets, or as I call them, swirly brackets, which represents the style declaration. So the CSS style declaration, which is inside of the style tag, or we can use an attribute or a separate document, which we'll get to in a future lesson. So for number 2, the opening and closing curly brackets represents a CSS style declaration. So far we have selected our tag or element with our selector, then we have started our CSS style declaration with the opening and closing swirly brackets. Next we have the property, so that's going to be color or text align in this case. So let's add a number 3 inside of the paragraph tag. Then after number 3 I'll put in quotes color as the first property, or text align is the property. So in CSS, the style, selector, and declaration is more or less going to be the same every time you use CSS, but the property and value are always going to be different, and there are almost endless combinations of properties and values. So next we'll add the value, which we have blue and center for in these examples, which is going to come after the colon but before the semicolon. So inside of the last paragraph tag, I'll add the number 4, and then in quotes, blue or center is the value. So we once again have the selector, the style declaration, and then the property and its value. So let's put this into action for the paragraph tags that we've been adding. So we'll select the paragraph tag using the letter P, then we'll add our opening and closing curly brackets for the CSS style declaration, followed by text align for the property, then our colon, our value, and the semicolon. So as you can see here, just with text align, we have a number of different options to choose from for our value, but I'm going to match it to the centered heading 1 text with text align center. Then one more visual as a reminder that I'm going to include attached to this lesson in the progress files download is this photographic example from the website Dev Dojo of the CSS syntax, which we've just covered. So in this next lesson, we'll cover the CSS box model, which is the most important part of CSS styling as it covers the spacing inside and around HTML elements. So let's start off by adding a ID, which will represent the first section, which has the red background. So let's start off with the hashtag followed by red. So this will be div ID red. And then inside of this, I'm going to add some lorem ipsum paragraph text. So we'll use the p tag followed by lorem, and then Visual Studio Code will fill out that text for us. And now what I'm going to do is copy this and paste it twice for the green and the blue sections. And then we can simply change the ID name to blue for the third and green for the second, so we can add different styling to each one of these three sections. You'll also notice that there's a border between each section. This way we can see the spacing that we add around the ID with the margin. So let's add a div tag here, and we'll just add some internal styling with width 100%, so it takes up the full width of the page. And then I'll add background color black, and we'll use padding to display the border for us instead of adding an actual border with the border CSS. So if we just add padding here, then since it's going to add padding to the top and bottom, if we were to do 10 pixels of padding, it's going to be 20 pixels high, or if we just do 1 pixel, that's going to give us 2 pixels by giving us 1 pixel on the top and the bottom. So I'm going to copy the same HTML beneath the green div ID as well as the blue ID, so we can see the spacing around each one of these elements that we've given the color to. So that's all the HTML that we'll include, and the rest will be styling these different sections and seeing how the CSS box model works with our styling. So let's add our internal style sheet with the style tag. Then once we add our style tag, the first thing that I'm going to do is add some styling to the body of the document itself, because you'll notice the border that we added doesn't take up 100% of the width. And that's because by default, Chrome adds some spacing or margin around the edges. So let's add body and then our open and closing curly brackets, then margin 0. And now if we save it, we'll see that we have 0 spacing in between the edges and our content. So let's start styling the red section that we see, which is the first div ID we gave it. And then we're going to add some border and some color to the ID. So let's select that, and then we'll move on to the green and blue afterwards. So let's add hashtag red, and then our opening and closing curly brackets, and I'll give this the background color red, and then I'm also going to apply a border around it. So we'll use border, and then we'll include all of the CSS here in the same style declaration with 2 pixels solid and black for our border. And this will be the same for each one of the sections or IDs apart from the background color. So let's copy this CSS and paste it in twice for both the green and the blue sections. And then we'll change this to green and this to green for the background color, as well as this one to blue, and change the ID to blue. Okay, one other thing that I'll do to make it easy for us to see the spacing around the text that's here is let's give our actual paragraph text a background color. So we'll say P and then background color white. Okay, so now we can see the spacing that's around the paragraph text by default inside of each one of the IDs. So with paragraph text, we have one way to separate the paragraph text within the actual paragraph tag, which is called line height. So if we add line height 30 pixels, which is going to be almost twice the height of the original 16 pixel text in Chrome, you'll see that the paragraph text is spaced apart pretty good. And apart from line height, we could always change the font size, as we know from our HTML lessons, but that still won't affect the inherent default margin that's around the outside of our paragraph text that we're seeing. So normally we would leave this in, but for the practice activity that we're doing right now with the box model, I'm going to remove it by adding margin 0 to all of our paragraph text. This way we can see all of the spacing that we add with padding inside of our red, green, and blue IDs. So let's start off by adding the padding to the red section. So we see that we have some padding on the top, the bottom, as well as the left and the right. So let's move back up to that hashtag red styling, and underneath border 2 pixels solid black, I'm going to add padding 20 pixels. And now if we just apply it with that one value of 20 pixels, it's going to be applied to the top, bottom, left, right. So each side of the element, and no matter what size we make this, as long as it's one value, it's going to be applied to each side of our content. So if we make it 200 pixels, we'll see that we have 200 pixels of space on either side of the paragraph text. So I'll leave it at 20 pixels, and then we can apply margin, which will appear outside of the border. So if we start to write margin, we'll see that we have the option to add it on the right, left, bottom, top, and that's not the correct order. It's actually top, right, bottom, left. But let's apply it to the bottom only here for a moment with bottom 40 pixels. And now we'll see 40 pixels of space underneath and outside of the border that we gave this section. And we can do the same thing with padding. So if we add padding bottom instead of padding right, left, top, if we just apply it to the bottom, and let's say we add 40 pixels of space, now we're going to have 20 pixels on every side except for the bottom, which we have 40 pixels for. Let's say for a moment that we deleted this padding 20 pixels all around and applied it after padding bottom. This is going to override the padding bottom because we have padding applied to each 4 of the sides. So with CSS, it's going to prioritize the last style declaration instead of the first, and anything that comes after the first further down the page will override the first style declaration. So now let's apply margin to this section. So you'll notice that we'll have margin on top that's different from all the other sides which have the same value. So what we'll need to do, as we just learned with the padding, is apply the margin to all sides first. So for example, margin 100 pixels all around is going to give us 100 pixels of space outside of the border. But if we change this to 50 pixels all around, that's going to match the original once we add a different value for the margin top. So remember, if we add it first, margin top, 10 pixels, it's still going to be overridden by the margin 50 pixels, which applies to each 4 sides. So I'm going to copy this and paste it underneath margin 50 pixels to apply a different value to the top. So now let's move on to the second section, which is the green ID. And we'll start off with some padding to this section. So you'll notice that we don't have padding on one side and we don't have margin on one side. So in this section, we'll specify a value for each side that we add padding and margin, starting with the top. So let's add padding top 20 pixels, and then we'll add padding right with a value of 80 pixels. So padding right 80 pixels. And then for the last value, we'll add padding left for our property, and then the value 80 pixels, similar to padding right. So when we apply it to each side of our content, we don't have to go in any specific order, but we'll get to the box model order, which we covered before in just a moment. First though, let's add the margin that we see on either side with it excluded on the left. So we'll add margin top of 10 pixels, and then we'll add margin right of 30 pixels, and then margin bottom 20 pixels. So this is going to match the finished version with the 0 padding on the bottom and 0 margin on the left. So now we can also apply all of these values in the same line of CSS for padding and margin. So that's what we're going to do with the blue section, is we're going to combine all of these into the same line. First though, let's get a reminder of the order which we covered briefly when adding borders in the last lesson. So I'm going to include this inside of CSS comments, the first of which will be the box model with all 4 sides covered. So it goes top, right, bottom, left. So let's, for example, say that we wanted to match the red section's padding using top, right, bottom, left, using the box model for our padding in the same style declaration. So in the red section, we used matching padding on each sides except for the bottom. So if we scroll back up in our style sheet, we'll find that we have padding on every side of 20 pixels and then padding bottom 40 pixels. So with top right, bottom left, we'll use padding 20 pixels top and then 20 pixels right, then 40 pixels bottom, and then 20 pixels left. So we have 20 pixels on top, right, and left, but bottom is 40 pixels. Now let's say that we wanted to match the padding from the green section. So in the green section, we have padding on the top, right, and left, but 0 padding on the bottom. So we would change the padding on the top, or actually we would leave that at 20 pixels, but we would change the right to 80 pixels. Then we would make the bottom 0, or you can add 0 pixels, so it doesn't matter, just 0 or 0 pixels. And then on the left, we have 80 pixels. So 20 pixel top, 80 right, 0 bottom, 80 left. So let's say that we wanted to get this down to 3 values instead of 4. In this case, since we're using the same spacing on the left and the right, if we just use 3 values here, it wouldn't make a difference. So with 4, we have top, right, bottom, left, but with 3, we have top, left, right, bottom. So right now with 2, we have 80 pixels on the left, right, and 20 pixels on the top, bottom. But once we add a third value after that, it's going to make it top, left, right, and then bottom. So top 20 pixels, left, right 80 pixels, bottom 0. And we can also make them all different with 50 pixels on the bottom and 10 pixels on the left as an example. So now let's add a CSS comment reflecting 3 values and then 2 values after that. So for 3, we have top as the first value, and then the second value will be a combination of right and left, or left and right, however you want to add it. And then the third will be the bottom. So top, right, left, and then bottom. Now, if we were to only have 2 values, it's going to be top, bottom as the first value, and then left, right, or right, left as the second value. So let's move on down, and you're welcome to mess around with these different values as you wish to apply different spacing around the elements. So I'm going to actually change the padding to only have 2 values here. So right now the video is trimmed as I decided I wanted 25 pixels top bottom, 50 pixels left right for the padding. Then for the margin, I'll also only use 2 values with margin 30 pixels top bottom and 50 pixels left right. And this has been the CSS box model. So that concludes our introduction to CSS with the CSS syntax and box model. Be sure to check out the courses in the video description, as well as the HTML email template design videos on the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.